All right, this video will introduce chapter 5 and the first section in it. And it has a few things. It kind of sets a general ground rules for IoT and some of the things that we have to consider. So the first thing is that, networks have always been around to connect things. The thing is, we're connecting not computers anymore, but we're connecting things, sensors. And all of these things haven't always been accessible over the internet, and that's kind of like what this whole Internet of Things is about, making those things accessible that currently weren't. Your refrigerator, your thermostat, your lights in your house, all sorts of things. And when we get into this, there's home and then there's industrial. And when you're in an industrial setting, things have to be much more reliable than when they are in a home setting, because you're talking high voltage things in a factory. You're talking about big robots that are hauling pieces of steel or running a steel furnace, that is hotter than our room gets sometimes when the heater's not working. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration if we are going to connect them. In the past, most things that we talked about in the picture down there in the bottom right, everything was sort of on their own separate network. You had a power network, you had a telephone network, you had a video network, and even in security sometimes. You would run coax cable throughout your warehouse, say, for example, with cameras, and that ran in its own system. The heat and the air conditioning in the warehouse was on its own thermostat. What you sold in your warehouse, what the inventory was, the data, all these things are on their own network, and it was really hard to jump from one to another, and even to collect information that when we talk about the data, how does the heating relate to the power? How does the security relate to the video? All those kind of things. But when we can put all those things on one network, not independent networks, but a converged network, then that makes all of this, the analytics and the management of all these things easier. So a lot of times when these things talk to each other, it's called M2M, machine to machine. So, for example, the air conditioner in your house senses that the thermostat senses that it is too cold, and it turns off the air conditioner, or whenever the temperature gets to what you want. Our cars are full of machine to machine devices, and all these things are digitized. And for example, with a car, you can buy a system now. Mechanic just basically connects it to a port in your car, and it downloads all the data that your car has been collecting while you've been driving it. And from there, he can determine what may need to be done in terms of maintenance or correcting a problem. Problem with all of this then is, we have all sorts of different vendors. Everybody's, is going to jump on the bandwagon. Everybody's going to come up with the next idea that's going to make them $1 million. And there's no standardization. So we have all these devices, but how do they integrate with each other? How do they fit together? And usually that involves protocols, and sometimes protocols if they're not open, they're proprietary. Well, that company goes out of business. Then guess what? That device you have, doesn't do you any good, and any security features that would go along with it are gone. There's nobody there to update firmware or applications. And as we know, there's always things in coding that has to be fixed. So Cisco kind of came up with these 6 pillars, and over in the study guide, they kind of review those, and you can go through those and read them. The one important thing that's kind of in there that as a new term is OT, which is operational technology. And that is, when we're talking about industry and a lot of different kind of networks that needs to mesh together, it can be very complex. There's a video in a section that kind of talks about some of these things that you should watch. And OT is basically Cisco's way of saying, okay, we have all this technology out there that operates. How do we put it together with the IT network to make things simpler and easier to work? So you can go through those 6 pillars in the study guide. And when we get to these different kind of ITs or IoTs, there's home, and then, as I said, there's industry, and industry is a whole separate ball game that has to deal with it differently than a home network. So with the Cisco IoT pillar, we can look at certain devices, kind of see where they fit in, and it helps you then figure out how you're going to support these and what they're going to be used for. So the other thing is, which is in this section down here, section 5117, industrial devices. I had an opportunity a couple years ago, again, when I was out in San Jose, to go to their Cisco's demo center, and they had this whole area set up of just industrial stuff. And it was kind of funny when you first look at it, because there's all these big heavy boxes, and I was like, well, what is all that stuff? And, well, that's a router, that's a switch, that's a wireless device. But because of the environment that it was going to be in, even though the guts of it might be the same, the outside casings and the way it interacts is totally different. And it also has to be much more reliable. The equipment that is used in there maybe can't be as sensitive as something that you might use in a home network, because there's too much relying on industry issue with an IoT device. Imagine the whole wire grid plugged into a little home router, and then we get a power surge or something, and our entire router goes down, the entire power in the whole area goes down. And it's also because of the industry, a lot of the stuff we use is going to be wireless. So it's things like cellular, low on, and the Wi-Fi mesh, which is really just a bunch of overlapping wireless devices, creating like so there's no dead spots, are all going to take on more importance, because you can't run cables all over some big factory, and the number of sensors that you need is quite a lot. If you did some of the packet tracers that go along with that, you'll kind of get a feel for what I mean in terms of this kind of stuff you have to keep track of. So all of this stuff, security, is important. And in the study guide, this first section here. Cisco has taken the idea of what goes on in a router or a network and kind of broken it down into three things. And if you ever go on to your a new CCENT, you're going to have to know these three planes. There's a control plane, a data plane, and a management plane. To kind of break up what is being done into three separate parts. So the control plane, that's probably something that, you know, we're a little more used to. I mean, that's like, that is the device itself and how the device makes forwarding decisions. So in a switch, you know, it's going to be based sort of like on the CAN table. On a router, it's going to be based on the network. But its control plane is the guy like at sort of like the lower level, you know, doing the actual forwarding and coming in here, going out there. The data plane is how we receive the data. So, you know, is it coming in, and what kind of frame is it coming in? Is it an Ethernet frame? Okay, here's how I have to read it. I'm going to read it and then say, okay, you know, it needs to go to this MAC address, or it needs to go to this IP address. Then I would, you know, give it to the control plane, and then he would send it on. Management plane is then the part that you know, we would interact with, like when we're doing command line, we're actually setting up a configuration or doing a firmware update. You know, that's the management plane. So it takes these activities that go on in a network, and it breaks them up. So control plane, he's the one doing actually the forwarding decisions. You know, the data plane is the one that says, okay, you know, here is the protocols we're using, and you know, here's how we're going to receive the data. Here's how we're going to, you know, forward it based, like, you know, on the IP address, the MAC address, or however. And then of course the management plane, here's how we're going to configure the device and you know, make it do what we want it to do. So once we break that down, then we have to secure those three things. And if you secure those three things a little bit differently. So securing the data plane, you know, that's where the data goes across the network devices. So things like, you know, blocking IP addresses, blocking MAC addresses, those kind of things, where you look at the data and see what is allowed or you know, what's not allowed. With the control plane, that's the part where, okay, we're going to have a password so that you know, you can't get into it at that, you know, at that level, and then the encryption that goes back and forth. So if you you know, he's the last guy who's going to be sending the stuff out, so he has to know, you know, well, what kind of encryption are we using when we send this data across? And then lastly, the management plane. I keep that updated by using patches, firmwares, you know, things like that are going to make sure that, you know, in the coding itself, that there's no issues. So in this, they have a couple of recommendations. So that's sort of in, mess that up. That's sort of in question number 9. And it gives you some tips, some recommendations of what you can do to keep that network secure. And I'm not going to go through this. You can look at this, and but it's something we've talked about before. You know, updates, passwords changing, access to the actual devices themselves. Don't leave something running that you don't need. That might open up a hole. And different cybersecurity solutions at the bottom there. Operational technology has to be, when we talk about things that have to be protected. Security and of those devices themselves, the network security, and then the actual physical security, locking things up in a room and not letting people get access to the actual device. So that's just a brief look at section 5.1. You got the study guide. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an introduction, and later on we'll break down section 5.2.